Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us again today. As you can see, we're still doing church remotely, and as long as it seems like this is the safest way to do it, we'll be doing it that way. So today I'd like to continue with an idea that I started with last week, which is the 7 I Ams. And this comes from John's Gospel. And as we mentioned last week, John's Gospel is different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Those three we call the Synoptic Gospels. John had something else in mind when he wrote his Gospel. And the main difference between them is that the intent of John's Gospel, he tells us in the very end, the reason he wrote. He said, I write these things to you that you may believe. And everything contained in John's Gospel is written with that in mind, to encourage the reader to believe in Jesus. And so John's, what he records in his Gospel of Jesus' teaching is very different than what we find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the teachings of Jesus that John records are all, or not all, mostly, primarily having to do with who he is, to the intent that his hearers, and his first hearers, of course, were Jews in Israel, the Old Covenant people of God, that they would believe in him. And then after his death and the shedding of his blood and the establishment of a new covenant, established in the blood of Jesus, that those who believed in him amongst the nation of Israel would become part of a broader, universal new covenant, and which includes all of us. And so we're looking at these passages where Jesus said, I am. And today I'd like to read from John's Gospel, chapter 10, beginning with verse 1. And begins this way. Jesus said, I am the door of the sheep. Verily, verily, I say unto you, that he that entereth not by the door into the sheepfold, but climbeth up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. But he that entereth in by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the porter openeth, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calleth his own sheep by name, and leadeth them out. And when he putteth forth his own sheep, he goeth before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. And a stranger will they not follow, but will flee from him, for they know not the voice of strangers. This parable spoke Jesus unto them, but they understood not the things which they were which he spake to them. Then Jesus said to them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, I am the door of the sheep. All that ever came before me were thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved, and he shall go in and out and find pasture. Now, in this parable and his explanation, of course, the sheep are ordinary individuals like you and me, and especially, as we'll see from the context later, first of all, those people to whom he was speaking in the nation of Israel, the Old Covenant people of God at that time, who recognized him as the promised Messiah and placed their faith in him at that time and believed in him. They're the sheep, and as we'll find out as we go on reading in a moment, there's other sheep, and that includes us, but the sheep are the individuals, the believers. So we can read ourselves into that, and it's no problem. He says, I'm the door, which is a curious thing, a curious way to describe himself. A door is a point of entrance. And I believe what he's saying when he says, I am the door, he's the avenue or the point of entrance into this new relationship with the Father, this new access, we might say. And he says, I am the door. If anyone enters in, he'll be saved. This thing that we call salvation, or being in right standing with God. However you want to express it, there's a lot of synonymous terms for that. But he says, I am the avenue, I am the door, I am the way in which it takes place. Now this is really important because he doesn't say, you try to get in on your own. In fact, he says, if you climb up some other way, then you're a thief and a robber. In other words, you can't enter into this condition of saved, or this condition of right standing with God, or whatever it is that he's describing here. You can't enter into it on your own. You have to enter in through the door. And so we as Christians, we can understand from that we have access to the Father, not because we did it ourselves, not because we performed in a certain way, not because of our strenuous moral striving or because of anything that we've done. It's simply that we entered in through the door. It has more about the door than the one entering in. We just enter in through the door. In fact, again, let me point it out. He says if you try to get in on your own and not come through the door, then you're disqualified. So if you think that you're entering into right standing with God by your performance or by your work, then you're equating yourself with a thief and a robber. That's not the right way to do it, according to how he expresses it here. Now, if we go on reading in John chapter 10, he's already said, I'm the door of the sheep. He's kind of speaking in a metaphoric way. And you should understand, by the way, this is a little side thought, so there's no charge for the little side thoughts. Jesus speaks in metaphors many times. That's what a parable is anyway. And we shouldn't be surprised as we read the Bible that, especially when you come to the end and get to a book like Revelation, it's all metaphors, it's all symbols. So when he's saying, I'm the door, he doesn't mean literally, obviously. He's speaking in symbols. Symbolic, metaphoric, spiritual language is very common in the teaching of Jesus and in anything that has a prophetic aspect to it. Okay, let's go on reading in John chapter 10, and he continues with this analogy or this metaphor, but he changes it a little bit. In the first part of the chapter, he was the door. So the I am for that one is I am the door. Next we read in chapter 10, verse 10, the thief cometh not but to steal and to kill and to destroy. But I am come that they might have life, and that they might have it more abundantly. Now let me stop there and comment on that for a minute. However you interpret the thief to be, and most people just say, well, that's the devil, and that's fair enough. But whatever the thief is, Jesus is not that. And so by contrast, he's saying, whatever kills or steals or destroys is not me. I didn't come to do that. I came that they might have life. And so we can understand right from this single verse here that anything that kills, steals, or destroys is not God, is not Jesus. He doesn't deal in things of that kind. He says, I have come that they, meaning the sheep, might have life, and that they might have it more abundantly. And the word abundantly there means in an overflowing measure. Now let me ask you a question. Is he speaking to people who are dead? Is he talking to the cemetery? No, he's not out in the cemetery preaching to the tombstones. When he says, I have come that they might have life, he's speaking to people who are already alive in the general sense. So obviously what he means, or apparently what he means, is a different kind of life. And we might say, since he's offering to give it, he's saying, I have come so that you might have the life that I have, to share his life with you, to impart his life to you so that you might have a life in common with him, which is not something that you achieved or created, but something you received from him. I have come that they might have life. Another translation I like, the Amplified, says, I have come that they might have and enjoy life, which I think is a good way to put it. I think that's his goal. He wants us not to be miserable, not to be sad, not to be like a starving hermit living in a cave. That's not having and enjoying life. I think he wants us to live our lives, to enjoy our lives, and I think that's a better witness for a Christian than somebody who's sad and sour and dour all the time. I think he wants to be a part of your ordinary life and just to live your life as a part of you, and you live your life as a part of him, a life lived in common with him. So he says, I have come that they might have life, and as the Amplified says, have and enjoy life, and that they might have it in an abundant, overflowing way. You see, he hasn't got any shortage. of his blessings. He hasn't got any lack. And he imparts his overflow to us, is what he's saying. Now let's go on reading. I am the good shepherd. This is the next I am. First, he said, I am the door. That's our avenue of entrance into a relationship with God through him. Now he says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd giveth his life for the sheep. But he that is an hireling, and not the shepherd, whose own the sheep are not, seeth the wolf coming, and leaveth the sheep, and fleeth. The wolf catches them, and scatters the sheep. The hireling flees because he's a hireling, and careth not for the sheep. I am the good shepherd, and I know my sheep, and am known of mine. As the Father knoweth me, even so know I the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. Now this, up until this verse, let's stop for a moment and comment on this. When he says, I am the good shepherd, he's saying, I care for the sheep. I am in charge of the sheep, and I'm watching out for the sheep. The sheep are us, of course. He's saying, I am in charge of their well-being. And not only that, he's in a veiled way here hinting at the fact that he is ultimately going to lay down his life for the sheep, for us, give his life so that we can have the life that he has. Now let's go on reading here in the next verse, because I think this is really important. Verse 16, listen to this. And other sheep I have, which are not of this fold. Them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice. And there shall be one fold and one shepherd. Now, let's don't pass over that. Let's stop and ponder what he's saying there. When he says, other sheep I have which are not of this fold, what does he mean? Well, consider who it is that he's speaking to. Jesus didn't go on a world tour. Jesus limited his ministry exclusively to the nation of Israel. Or if you want to say it a different way, he limited his ministry to the Old Covenant people of God. They were first in line. It was proper and correct that he go to them first, because they were the people of God under the existing covenant, under the Old Covenant. And they are who he was talking about when he says this fold. And you know, if you read in the Gospels carefully, you'll notice many times when Jesus says things that express this truth. You know, there was a woman that came to him and said, my daughter lieth at home sick, tormented of a demon, come and heal her. And he said, it's not appropriate for me to take the children's bread and to cast it to dogs. And in that context with that woman, who was not a Jew, she was a Greek, a Syro-Phoenician woman, an outsider. He says, I can't take what belongs to the children and give it to the dogs. And that was really a rude thing to say to her. And then he finally explained it, and he says, I am not sent to anyone except the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, I've read commentators who say, well, he was just using reverse psychology, and I don't really understand what the point of that would be. But no, I believe he meant exactly what he said. In his earthly ministry, he was not sent to anyone except the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Again, that he used this expression, sheep. He's like a shepherd seeking for the lost sheep. Before the ministry of Jesus could become universal for the whole world, he had to first fulfill the ministry to the nation of Israel. And so as he's here speaking, he's speaking to an exclusively Jewish audience, an exclusively Old Covenant nation of Israel in the first century audience. And I want to be careful and say it that way because, you know, when we're speaking about this and what's about to come here, because, you know, as you know, many of them rejected him. And because they rejected him, there were dire consequences. And so we're speaking about an Old Covenant and a nation of Israel 2,000 years ago with no reference to anyone who happens to be ethnically Jewish today or even to the political nation of Israel that exists today. This is not an anti-Semitic message. We're just merely reading what is in the Scripture and trying to put it in the context of the first century. Now, when he says, other sheep I have, which are not of this fold, them I must bring. He's talking about you and me. He's talking about Gentiles. He's talking about people who were never under the old covenant, who were never a part of that old way of doing things. And he's saying to those people who were listening to him at that time, you're my sheep right now, but I've got some others I've got to get to. And there's going to be one fold. In other words, there's just going to be one group. No more division anymore. No more separation. No more us and them. Everyone who believes in Christ and puts their faith in him will be part of the same fold, as he says, the same group, all the same kind of sheep, in other words, based on their faith in Christ. Them also I must bring. They will hear my voice, and there shall be one fold and one shepherd. Therefore doth my Father love me, because I lay down my life, that I might take it again. No man taketh it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have the power to lay it down, and I have the power to take it again. This commandment have I received of my Father. He's talking about the fact that when he later goes to the cross, of course, there was all kinds of things that happened that set that up, but he's saying, I'm the one that laid it down. I voluntarily gave my life for the sheep. If you talk, or if you consider and read the passages that talk about the death of Jesus and all of the things concerning it, you find an interesting thing in Hebrews chapter 2, and the writer to the Hebrews said, by the grace of God, he tasted death for every man. He doesn't mean by that when he said he tasted death for every man, he doesn't mean that we who believe on him were never going to die physically. He's speaking spiritually. In the same way that he's said, I've come that you might have life, he didn't mean physical life, he meant spiritually. And when Hebrews says he tasted death for every man, he means spiritual death. That is to say, the death that is the result of sin, the death that is the spiritual outcome of sin. We could call it rejection of God. That's why when a person puts their faith in Jesus and enters into a relationship with God through faith in him, as we read last week when he said, I'm the bread that came down from heaven, he said, everyone that the Father gives will come to me, and once that person's with me, I hold on and I don't let go. That's what the Message translation says. King James says, I shall in no wise refuse or reject. There's no rejection for a Christian, because Jesus has already taken the penalty for sin. He's tasted death for every person. That's why he says here for these sheep that he's talking to, and for us as well, I'm going to lay down my life for you sheep. I'm going to take the death, and you might say, if to use Hebrews' perspective on it, I'm going to experience the punishment that you deserve so that you can have the life that I have. So he says, nobody takes my life from me. I lay it down of myself. Now there's one more I want to get to today, and I read that one in John chapter 10, especially because I wanted to read this one. I wanted you to have that perspective. And I want you to keep in mind as I read this, the perspective that Jesus presented in John chapter 10, when he said, other sheep I have that are not of this fold. There's no other way to interpret that except to say that he had in mind the fact that he was speaking to an old covenant, strictly nation of Israel, the first century Jewish audience at that time. And he foresaw a broader audience consisting of everyone else who would also believe in him. But at that moment, at that time, he's only speaking to that exclusive group, the nation of Israel in the first century, who were still living in an old covenant. And he wanted to make sure that they made the transition into the new covenant. Now keep that in mind as we read what we read next. This is coming from John chapter 15. This is the next I am. This I am is, let's read verse 1. He says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman. The husbandman means the one who takes care of the vine and the branches, as we'll see. I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman. Every branch in me that beareth not fruit, he taketh away. And every branch that beareth fruit, he purgeth it, that it might bring forth more fruit. Now you are clean through the word which I have spoken unto you. By the way, let's just stop there and talk for a moment. Now I'm going to get to this part where he said, every branch in me that beareth not fruit, he taketh away. But let's set that aside for now. He says, every branch in me that beareth fruit, he purgeth it. Now the word that's translated purge there also appears in the next verse. Now you are clean. It's the exact same word that's used in the Greek language. In one verse he says purge, in the next verse he says clean, but I think you understand that. See, people sometimes read passages like this and get alarmed and get scared and get disturbed. I don't think he presented any of this so that we reading it would become alarmed and scared and disturbed. Now, let's be honest, the people that were living in the first century that were listening to him, they were in a critical generation. Jesus singled out that generation specifically. There are 7 times in the Gospels when Jesus, and not just John, when Jesus said, these things will come upon this generation. They were living in a critical time. They were living in a dangerous time because they were living in the time of transition as the old covenant was coming to an end and the new covenant was coming into being. They had to jump out of one and into the other one, a completely different kind of covenant. And Jesus was concerned that they should do that. Well, let's get this part about clean first. Every branch in me that beareth, let's see, this is verse 2. Every branch in me that beareth fruit, he purgeth it, that it bring forth more fruit. I started to say people read this and get scared and they think, well, he's purging me with that car accident I had, or with that cancer, or with this deadly disease, or with, I don't know what. I fell down and got a broken arm and God's teaching me something. You hear that all the time. Any kind of calamity or misfortune that happens to anyone, people somehow jump to the conclusion that God did that to teach me something. And what I wonder is, if that's true, why don't we ever learn it? And the other thing is, if that's how God teaches, well, he's worse than a human father. You know, if a human father taught their children by breaking their arms and crashing their head against the wall, that's an abusive father. And we put people like that in jail, and rightly so. I would tend to say that God is at least better than that. He's at least not that bad. God doesn't teach with the blunt instrument of calamity and misfortune. What kind of lesson is that? Jesus, listen to what he says here. He explains it very well. Every branch in me that beareth fruit, he purgeth it, not by misfortune or calamity, but he says, now you are clean, purged, through the word which I have spoken unto you. The way he cleans, the way he purges, the way he teaches is through his word alone. He doesn't use blunt instruments to teach us. He uses his word coming into your mind and changing your thinking and changing your understanding and changing your motivation and changing your heart and doing what he wants to do through the avenue of his word. His word is much more effective than these calamitous events that people sometimes like to say that this is how God is teaching them. So he doesn't teach us through misfortune. He teaches us through his word. And Jesus clearly makes that point here. Now you are clean through the word which I have spoken unto you. Now we need to address this issue of verse 2. Every branch in me that beareth not fruit, he taketh away. Now what did he mean by that? Let's go on reading in verse 4. Abide in me, that means stay put or live. Abide in me and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself, except it abide in the vine, no more can you except you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He that abideth in me and I in him, the same bringeth forth much fruit. For without me you can do nothing. If a man abide not in me, he is cast forth as a branch, and is withered, and men gather them and cast them into the fire, and they are burned. Now I understand why people read that and get scared and get alarmed. And you also have to remember that the devil is right there with you reading the Bible. I guarantee you and promise you that the devil knows the Bible at least as well as you do, and better. And anytime you read the Bible, the devil reads along with you. And anytime you read something like that that could take on an alarming character, he's right there on your shoulder to tell you, yep, that's talking about you. It's not talking about you. Listen, Jesus is not talking about Christians in this verse, because as of yet there are no Christians. What there are Jewish believers in Jesus. And you notice what he says here. He says, abide in me. Any branch that does not abide in me. You see, it's like this. He didn't say anything about if you do something wrong or make a mistake or fail in some way, I'm going to throw you out. He said, abide in me, stay in me. Here's what he means. He's saying, I've got these followers here, these people who are listening to me, and we want to make it into a new covenant. As of yet, there is no spiritual rebirth possible. They are just people that are listening to him and believing in him. He's saying, you better stay with me. Don't leave me and go back to another way of doing things, especially, as the writer to the Hebrews said, don't go back to temple worship and make an animal sacrifice again after you've placed your faith in the sacrifice of Jesus. He's talking to his believers in the first century, the Jewish believers under the Old Covenant, who were following him and listening to him, and at that moment believing in him. And he's saying, stay put, stay hooked up with me, because if you disconnect from me, if you leave me and go away, he says, here's what's going to happen. They're going to bundle you into bundles and burn you. Now, we don't need to read hellfire into that, and I don't believe that's what he's talking about. I don't think he's talking about an afterlife in hell. I think he means literally what happened in that generation to those who were alive in Israel who didn't take his advice in Matthew chapter 24 and get out of town, get out of Dodge when the Roman armies came. You know, in Matthew 24, and I don't mean to get off the subject here, he told them, he says, when you see Jerusalem encompassed about with Roman armies, he didn't say Roman, when you see Jerusalem compassed about with armies, know that its desolation is near, and let him that's in the field keep on going and run to the mountains. And if you're on the housetop, don't come back for your things. Just get out of town as quick as you can. He was concerned with them saving their lives, because what happened to those that stayed was the Romans burned everything, and they killed millions of people. They slaughtered the city of Jerusalem, men, women, and children. They burned the temple. They threw it to the ground. All the cities round about, they devastated all of those things. It happened in 70 A.D. And when Jesus says here, if you don't stay put in me, you're liable to end up like a branch cast forth into the fire and burned. First of all, he's not talking to Christians. He's talking about people of his generation that he was concerned with them making it into the new covenant. Don't let the devil condemn you and tell you, well, you failed, you made a mistake, and he's going to throw you away. He didn't say anything about throwing any branches away. Did you notice that? He never said, I'm going to throw these branches out. He said they left. He said, if a man abide in me, they chose to go away and to go and do something else. You know, the same thing, we didn't read it, but in the previous message when we talked about when Jesus said, I am the bread of life, when he went on talking to those people, he says, you know, I've told you I'm the bread that came down from heaven, but you don't believe in me. And at the end of that little episode in chapter 6, we didn't read all of this. Most of them, they all left except the disciple. They all went away. They all left him. So they started off good, but then they left him and abandoned him. And then he turned to his disciples and he said, well, will you leave also? And they said, Peter said, where should we go? You have the words of life. And so in this passage in John chapter 15, Jesus is not speaking to Christians because there are no Christians yet. He's speaking to his Jewish followers and warning them that you need to stay plugged into me. Now as a Christian, it's true. He's the vine and we're the branches. But you see, first of all, there's no temptation really, and there's no way to unplug from him as a Christian. See, they weren't spiritually connected to him. As a Christian, you are born from above, and you can't undo that. John said it this way, as many as received him, to them he gave the power to become the sons of God, who were born, not of the will of man or the will of the flesh, but born of God. You can't undo a birth. You abide in him as a Christian because you're already plugged into him. Now, in case you don't accept my analysis of this passage, I would recommend that, I'm not going to do it right here, I would recommend that you read Paul's letter to the Romans, in which in chapter 11 he used this precise analogy and made the exact same application. And chapters 9, 10, and 11 in Romans are Paul's explanation for why it is that, by and large, the nation of Israel rejected Jesus, their own Messiah. And he uses this exact precise analogy that Jesus said. That he said they were like branches, and they were broken off because they didn't believe in him. That's the only factor. And Jesus said to his Gentile readers, says, you are like branches from a wild olive tree, and you're grafted in. But it's only because you believed. It's not because you're so great. And the only reason they got broken off is because they didn't believe. So it all comes down to this. If you believe in Jesus, if you place your faith in Jesus, you're plugged into him. And that's the only reason, and that's the only connection. You're plugged into him. You are a branch that's plugged into him. Here's the broader picture, though, for us. He's the vine, and we're the branches. He's the source of the life. We are the recipients of the life. He's the source of the salvation. We are the objects of his salvation. He's the source of everything. We don't produce anything. You know, Paul said it this way, writing to the Ephesians, we Christians, that is, we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works that he hath before ordained, that we should walk in them. So the point is this, he is the source of the life, and we are the expression of the life. Okay, I got 3 of them in this time. We did 2 the first time and 3 more. What's that? 5. We have 2 more to go. So next week we will conclude this idea of the 7 I ams, and we'll see you then. Thank you.